Good evening, Trinity Tigers and friends of Trinity. I'm taking this opportunity to welcome each one of you to the second call to action, a three-part webinar series hosted by Trinity's Office of Alumni Relations and the Office of Special Events. Tonight, we will discuss the topic, African Americans, Disparities in Educational Experiences. My name is Dr. Deneese Jones, and I have the privilege to serve as the Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Trinity University. And I'm pleased to have this chance to moderate this second webinar. At this time, it is my distinct honor to present four very distinguished panelists for our discussion this evening. Let me start with Dr. Enrique Aleman, who serves as the Lillian Radford Endowed Professor of Education at Trinity University. As a first-generation college student, Dr. Aleman merges his personal and professional interests with research that has the potential to address the racialized and institutionalized inequities that have impacted historically underserved students and communities of color. Next, we have Mr. P.R. Seth, Trinity alumnus, class of 2019. PR is a graduate student and graduate research fellow at the Center of Medical Humanities and Social Medicine at Johns Hopkins University. His research connects with the nexus of artistic expression, humanistic inquiry, and well-being, focusing on Black thought, political epidemiology, and social suffering, and racial violence to humanize medical practice and education. Dr. Tara Smith, Trinity alumni, class of 2003 and MAT 2004, is the next panelist. She is the founder and educational consultant with TS Consulting Services. Dr. Smith serves in the venue of change with PK-12 educators and parents on topics related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And we are especially delighted to have with us Dr. Gwendolyn Webb, Associate Professor and Administration Program Coordinator at Texas A&M University College Station. A longtime personal friend and colleague of mine, Professor Webb teaches courses in culturally responsive leadership, urban school administration, instructional leadership development, and home, school, and community partnerships. Welcome to our panelists. For those of you who have joined on this webinar, we invite you to submit your own questions using the Q&A tab, and the panelists will be invited to address them before the conclusion of the session. Now, with those introductions completed and the directions for Q&A solidified, let's turn our attention to Dr. Enrique Aleman and Dr. Gwendolyn Webb to seek their perspective on the first of the four sets of broad questions. Education has always been of utmost importance to the African American community, from desegregating K-12 schools and colleges to managing historically Black colleges and universities. In fact, the African American community has always championed equity of opportunity and access for students, because in this country, it has long been the key to social mobility and economic independence. Today's topic has a keen focus on the disparities in education for African American students. In the K-12 setting, research narratives denote that compared with white students, Black students are more likely to be suspended or expelled, less likely to be placed in gifted programs, and subject to lower expectations from their teachers. So here's the question. How would you define disparities in education for African American students? Dr. Alumni and Dr. Webb.
Well, I think that is a dynamic question because disparities themselves talk about differences and significant differences that make one population dissimilar to another population. So for African Americans, our disparities can be summed up in disproportionality. So as we look at the history of education for African American children and youth in the United States, from the beginning to now, it's about overrepresentation or underrepresentation within specific groups. And that disproportionality is problematic on many, many levels because so many people don't understand the cultural manifestations of the African American community. So in 1906, W.E.B. Du Bois made a call to our nation to say, we want our children educated. And he ended his essay by saying, they have a right to know, to think, and aspire. It's 2021, and we're still saying they have a right to know, to think, and aspire. But disproportionality is a problem. So for example, African American children make up 16% of the school-age population. In the United States, 13.8% of us are African American. Now, when we go into the school with to the schools with that 16% population, 46% of our children qualify for free and reduced lunch. 35% of them are suspended or expelled from school on a daily basis. And they are 35% of all who are suspended. And remember, they're only 16% of the population. 28.5% of all the children identified as having emotional disturbances are African Americans. 34% of those children who are perceived as having cognitive disabilities or intellectual disabilities, African American. And then only 8% are identified as gifted and talented. So we go from overrepresentation to underrepresentation. Our graduation rates are lower than any other group of children in the United States. This is found in Texas. This is found all over the nation. In terms of AP or IB participation, only 16.2% of the children who participate in that program are African American. We have a 3% dropout rate nationwide, and it is the lowest among all groups. So we have the poorest outcomes, and most important, we have a sense of grave disrespect for the integrity and the strength of African American learners. And I'm so excited about this conversation tonight because it's places like Trinity University that can immediately make a difference by looking at their reach as they develop teachers and as well as they develop scholars throughout the entire university to look to see not only what K through 12 can do, but also what the university level for undergraduate and graduates can do to really highlight the importance of looking at these disparities and saying, finally, Black lives matter.
It's a really tough act to follow with Dr. Webb. Thanks, Dr. Jones, for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And yeah, a lot of the same points that Dr. Webb has already mentioned get me to think about how I define the disparities or how I try to understand the disparities in African American educational experiences. First of all, is historical, understanding it from a historical oppression framework. Second of all is looking at P20 inequities across structures and institutions. And third, in my own line of work, I think is in the way that we understand the preparation of teachers and the preparation of educational leaders. With historical oppression, one of my major inspirations as a scholar has always been Professor Derek Bell, known to all and known to many as the founder of critical race theory, a longtime legal professor, law professor, who really inspired me by this concept of racial realism. And it's a philosophy, he kind of coined it as a philosophy that requires us to acknowledge the permanence of racism. And it is when we understand the permanence of racism in US society and in our structures that we are able to then create strategies to combat and challenge those structures. Dr. Webb mentioned, if anything history has taught us is that historically schools were not designed for African Americans. They were designed to work in the way that would push out, would not advantage, would not fund, would not keep the African American school at the center of community. And so understanding these problems historically, it is no wonder that we continue to see the kinds of indicators that we do. On the second point with P20, understanding these disparities as a P20 from pre-kindergarten all the way through graduate school. I think it's important, as was already mentioned, looking at access to advanced placement, understanding that the school to prison pipeline starts very, very young, especially for Black boys, and trying to figure out ways to challenge and disrupt those pathways into the prison pipeline. Teacher quality, access to teacher quality, access to Black teachers, Black principals, administrators is extremely important. And I know in our Department of Education, that is something that we're actively talking about, that we need to do a better job of preparing and recruiting and retaining that next generation of educators and educational leaders. And finally, as was mentioned, what does that mean for the pipeline and pathway into higher education? I know Trinity is having these conversations, and it's an ongoing conversation that has to happen as we continue to push our students and African American students in particular into undergraduate years, but then into graduate school. This idea of recruiting them, retaining them, and graduating them, I think is extremely important as we understand these disparities. Lastly, I know we're up against time, is what is it that we need to do to train that next generation of educators, Black educators? Students, it's important students see themselves. It's important that students have those role models in leadership positions. Whether it's in K-12 or in higher ed, they need to be able to see themselves, and we need to have those types of leaders that are prepared to make a difference in those universities and colleges and K-12 campuses.
Thank you. Now I'd like to get some perspective from Mr. Seth and Dr. Alumni again for the second question. What would it take to move from these solely deficit-based narratives to decisions to strengthen policy conversations that can fundamentally change the educational experiences for African American students? Mr. Seth?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Jones. I want to thank everyone for being here. It's a privilege to be a part of this panel and be a part of this conversation this evening. So I think for this question, I'm going to warn you all, I'm a theorist, so I have a tendency to be a bit broad. But I think the point that I'm drawn to think about here is on confronting epistemic violence. And what do I mean when I say epistemic violence? What I'm referring to here are the history of ideas, knowledge production, meaning making, and how information and how data, how they're all evaluated, received, and interpreted. So I suppose when I think about this idea of there being a deficit in Black communities, my immediate response is to say, to be quite frank, well, that's just untrue, right? And I think, for example, if you were to think about early theories of race and racism, right? Think about someone like Immanuel Kant, someone that advanced this notion that Black folk didn't have the same capacity to reason as white folk, that Black folk had smaller brains, and that race was a biological concept, right? It's just not true. And it's just not as easy to say, well, Kant died 200 some odd years ago, and that's in the past. I can speak from personal experience here as a medical school affiliate. I know too many medical practitioners that believe in fixed racial traits, that believe that race is a biological concept rather than a sociopolitical idea, that do not distinguish between race, racism, racialization, the skin, biology, to name a few, right? So even folk with the highest level of education are missing something when it comes to the history of race and racism in medicine, where they ultimately end up advancing notions that are not only prejudicial, but false. And we have the research out there, right? And it's certainly, I mean, I think an easy answer would say more courses and more training on race and racism, but getting to this point on education, when I think about education, and I think about the fact that for the longest time, we've said that test scores probably aren't the best way to measure student success, that test scores conceptually, theoretically, empirically, in short, have a tendency to be very racist, right? This isn't a new idea, and we have the research to prove it, right? That once you expand your understanding of educational success beyond test scores or particular kind of metrics, then all of a sudden your understanding of the problem changes, and you realize that Black kids are just as talented, smart, and gifted as anyone else. We have the research, we have the books, we have the data, and schools still require the SAT, the ACT, and the GRE, right? So I know this isn't necessarily a concrete answer to the question, but I think the problem that we're wrestling with here, and when it comes to these deficit-based narratives, is this question of how how do we displace racist bodies of thought? How do we expand beyond binary thinking? How do we get people to engage with the world and its complexity? But also, how do we get folk to read, right? I think James Baldwin said it best. You'll think you have a good understanding of the world, but then all of a sudden you read. So I think what I'm suggesting is we have to really think deeply about how people and how institutions, how they value, how they interpret, and how they evaluate bodies of thought. And if they're going to provincialize certain bodies of thought over others, then there's something much deeper going on there. So epistemic violence is this kind of refusal, intentional or unintentional, of an audience to communicatively reciprocate, right? Even when data allows for equally viable interpretations, we choose to see inferiority. And it's also a problem because these interpretations of data emerge from an academic context and they're presented as knowledge, right? All knowing. And these epistemologies have a tendency to grab a hold of our cerebral world. And it's a disruption to our social order because there's a kind of violence that's going on there because this information is misguided. And I guess to the last point, I know we're running out of time here, but as I start to think about policymakers, I don't really know what to say to policymakers, especially when in the policy world, rarely do those in policy believe that the best plan is to start from scratch. Instead, they usually start by confronting the most visible kind of conflict of a current policy and evaluate how those difficulties can be addressed without creating some kind of political uproar or within an acceptable budget, right? And that's not going to work when we fundamentally have to rethink the way that education is measured. So it's a rather grim picture, but I think we have to really think deeply about how information is processed and evaluated by institutions, policymakers, and the like. So.
Yeah, that's great, PR. I think it leads to a lot of my thinking on this question of how you combat or how you challenge deficit-based notions of the African American students and communities that teachers and schools are working with. I go back to Derek Bell and in the introduction to his Faces at the Bottom of the Well, cutting edge book. He describes an elder. He was a former civil rights attorney, so he worked for the NAACP, fought a lot of these desegregation court cases, and he describes a time in the 1960s on one of these civil rights marches, and talking to an elder who was barely walking, but she was walking, she was marching, and having a conversation about whether or not she thought things were going to change. And she basically says, like, I know I'm not going to live to see the transformation, but I'm here basically to be a thorn in the side of white supremacy. That resilience, that struggle, I think is part of what I would consider a community cultural wealth framework that can be used to challenge deficit-based notions. And what I mean by that is, there are scholars that have influenced me, African-American, mainly African-American scholars, Dr. Ladson Billings, Patricia Hell Collins, Bell Hooks. In ed leadership, it's Doctors Judy Alston, Terry Watson, Linda Tillman. Scholars who have highlighted the Black experience and have centered the Black narratives that are already there of struggle, of resilience, of activism, of leadership. Although traditional frameworks don't identify it as leadership, the elder that Derek Bell's talking about, that was a leader in a community that has already been part of the community that we should actually highlight and we can learn from. And so by highlighting these ideas of the community cultural wealth that's already there, and what I mean by that is a lot of our communities don't have financial wealth, but there's a tremendous amount of community cultural wealth, the resistance, the historical, people struggling for and doing what they need to do to take care of their families and surviving. That's the cultural wealth that I think can be used to push back against these deficit notions in African American communities. And the second thing I would say is this idea of policy advocacy and empowerment. Very fortunate to work with my two colleagues, Dr. Sonia Douglas Horsford and Philip Smith from Teachers College, New York City. We wrote a piece taking an African American experience and a Mexican American experience and talking about policy coalitions. And so I think another way to kind of challenge deficit-based notions is to figure out ways of building coalitions in solidarity with other communities of color. In my own community, I think we need to do a much better job of learning from the Black struggle and figuring out ways to be in much more solidarity and coalition with our communities. And so, empowerment of youth, and again, recruiting, retaining, and keeping Black teachers is extremely important in pushing back against these deficit notions. I wanted to read real quick, if I have time, just a real quick note. In doing this work with Sonia and with Philip, we found this letter. It was what's known to be the only time that Cesar Chavez communicated with Dr. King. In 1966 letter, he wrote, "As brothers in the fight for equality, I extend the hand of fellowship and goodwill and wish continuing success to you and your members. The fight for equality must be fought on many fronts, in the urban slums, in the sweatshops of the factories, and in the fields. Our separate struggles are really one, a struggle for freedom, for dignity, and for humanity. He concluded the letter by offering his services. This was September 1966. And to me and to Sonia and to Philip, it's an example of the coalition building that can be used as a way to push back and to challenge the deficit notions that are in our communities of color.
Fantastic, gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, here's my third question. First, the context. It's impossible to ignore the K-12 classrooms in the US are filled with students from increasingly diverse cultural backgrounds, race, nationality, religion, economics, and so on. Many teachers, though, still aren't sure how to move from recognizing the diversity to creating a mutually responsive learning environment. To negate this type of educational experience, some scholars define culturally responsive teaching as instructional practices that recognize, honor, and leverage cultural diversity in educational settings, with the goal of ensuring the academic success of our students. Now, I'm turning to Dr. Smith and Mr. Seth for their responses to this question. What would you offer as key principles for educators to understand and value how culture impacts learners? And share a few examples to illustrate those key principles.
First off, I want to say thank you for having me on this very illustrious panel of excellence that is here. And I want to say thank you to Trinity for putting this on. When I attended Trinity, I was one of 25 African Americans on the campus my whole 4 years. And I'm sure that's much different than Mr. Seth's experience, but we were a small group. And that was 20 plus years ago. And think of the work that Trinity has done to increase the diversity on the campus, particularly in African Americans. Kudos to Trinity for working through that. But to your question, culture is everything to identity. And if a student can't see themselves inside the classroom, then how do they engage in the learning? If they can't see that their teacher wants to know more about them and wants to include their identity within the learning experience, then it's very hard for them to engage because they don't see the relevancy to the learning process if there is not a two-way interchange between the teacher and the student or the leader and the student. Also, when you think about culturally responsive teaching, a lot of people, educators, new teachers, or educators that are experienced, hear that phrase and think, is there a strategy? Is there a workbook? Is there a program that I can just buy, that I can just use, and then I'll check that off my list? And that's not what culturally responsive teaching is. It's a mindset and it's a process. And the first thing that you have to do is be able to believe all students can learn, all students can grow, and all students can bring value to the learning experience. So the whole mindset about looking at African Americans and students of color overall, and that they all have the ability to learn at high levels, is key. Because if you don't have high expectations, then your practices and your behaviors will not follow. They just can't. So that's a whole mindset shift that we have to work on with all educators. Once you get that mindset that all students can learn, then you can start thinking about, how do I get to know my students? Because it's extremely important that educators take the time to learn about their students. And if you have African American students in your classroom, you can't just use your own notions of what their culture is, because basically we all have implicit bias. What we're exposed to, what we have grown up around, what images or interactions that we've had with African Americans will influence what we think about African Americans. So if an educator thinks, I know the culture of African Americans and I'm just going to use what I think is their culture, you may be way off. You may be in a campus that is filled with Black and brown students, but they come from affluent families, and you may think, well, then how do I work with it? They don't have the needs that I think that all Black kids or brown kids have. So you have to understand who you're working with and get to know your population directly. What are their needs? What are their strengths? How do we pull in their identities as an asset to the learning experience? what ways can we utilize what they already bring to the table to help them thrive and grow in the learning environment? All these things are a full long process that doesn't happen overnight. So there is no book, there is no one strategy, there is not one thing that makes you a culturally responsive teacher. It's your whole practice. And that whole practice is a lifelong work. And one of the things that we have to get away from with especially experienced teachers is allowing teachers to continue the same practices from 20 to 25 years ago that no longer fit our students, that exclude our students, or in some ways reinforce the negative stereotypes that we have of Black and Brown students. So we have to address that as educators. We have to have those hard conversations when we see that and call it out and find ways to grow our teachers and our leaders too, because we want this to be a whole system effort. It can't just be in isolation, because then the system doesn't ever change. And that's a whole lot to unpack here, but that's kind of my answer in a nutshell.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, for that. And you're absolutely right. Trinity has done a lot of really great work as far as, kind of thinking about advancing equity in education. And I actually wanted to take a moment to kind of reflect on my experience here as an undergraduate. As an undergraduate student here at Trinity, I had the opportunity to create my own interdisciplinary second major in social theory and African-American history. And that was a fantastic opportunity. But I had to do that because Black studies, African-American studies, wasn't formally institutionalized in the form of an academic department. And I want to be clear that this is not an indictment of Trinity by any means, right? Trinity is not unique in this respect. Black studies is underfunded across the nation. And Black studies departments, to be quite frank, are always the first to get cut, or interdisciplinary departments like women and gender studies, cultural studies, modern thought and literature. And this is often where Black scholars, Black folk often find themselves being appointed, because it's impossible to have this kind of unidimensional kind of reading of Black life. And amid COVID-19, we've seen institutions across the country have to scale budgets back, and Black studies departments are being cut at an alarming rate. Many institutions already didn't necessarily need an excuse to cut Black studies. And now with COVID, it's gotten much worse. So I think the first answer that I have to this question is we have to fund Black studies. It's inexcusable for all of these institutions across the country to not have Black studies departments. And for that to happen, you're also going to need Black faculty. And I think that's a separate kind of story. The second point I actually want to make is actually on the syllabus and actually thinking deeply about what we assign. And I think it also relates to an earlier point that I made on epistemic violence. It's this question of how is it that someone like Du Bois, a founder of American sociology, can be omitted from an intro to sociology kind of course? How is it that Zora Neale Hurston, who's an ethnographer, an anthropologist, right, trained by Franz Boas, one of the founders of American anthropology, she's not read in anthropology, right? And how is it that someone like Frantz Fanon, arguably one of the most famous Black psychologists of all time, isn't considered by psychologists? Ida B. Wells isn't getting read at all, right? Or even worse, you have your race week at the end of the semester where you assign Malcolm X, The Ballad of the Bullet, or King's I Have a Dream, or Letter from the Birmingham Jail, right? And I love Malcolm X, right? I do a lot of work with Black thought. But we have to put a little bit more thought into what we assign and what we are reading. And I think the biggest problem here, again, is that we have this idea that, well, what could we ever learn from Frantz Fanon about psychology? What could we ever learn from Ida B. Wells? There's this constant kind of devaluation of Black studies and Black thought, right? And in many respects, we'd never question why we'd read someone like John Rawls in philosophy, or why we'd read someone like Immanuel Kant or Martin Heidegger. And I'm not actually of the belief that we should just throw all of these older texts away. But what I'm saying is that in order for you to understand someone like, for example, Sigmund Freud, you'd have to read someone like Frantz Fanon, because Fanon is writing against Freud, right? And I think the way that we've been structuring the syllabus is really doing us a disservice, right? And I'm not saying never assign old white folk and only assign Black folk. But what I'm saying is that I think it's to really ask this question: what would it mean to read someone like Charles Mills alongside John Rawls, or to read someone like a Sigmund Freud alongside of Frantz Fanon, to read Sylvia Wynter alongside Immanuel Kant, right? I think we can do a better job K through 12, and especially in higher education at the undergraduate and graduate level. We can do a better job of placing bodies of literature in conversation with one another. And we need to constantly be thinking about what we assign and stay up to date with what folk are talking about. It requires teachers to hone their craft, professors to hone their craft, but it also requires us always to not only be teachers, but also learners. So I think, in short, the 2 points that I'd kind of focus on would be committing to Black studies. And the second point would be really thinking deeply about what we assign and how we teach what we assign. I think that would really be huge for education.
you. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, I pause now to remind you that you may submit your questions using the Q&A tab as you listen to the responses, and the panelists, I'm sure, will be happy to address them before the conclusion of tonight's session. Please note that we are not using chat for submitting questions during this webinar. Now, back to our panel. Let me ask Dr. Webb and Dr. Smith the fourth and final question. Again, the context. People in high social classes are likely to have greater educational attainment than those in lower social classes. Because members of high social classes tend to be better educated and have higher incomes, they're at an advantage to provide educational opportunities to their children. This can affect college readiness experiences. Here's my question. Do these differences exist for the African American community? Explain your reasoning and some of the outcomes for educational attainment in social and economic class.
Dr. Smith, you please go first because I went first on the other question.
My pleasure. So I think that this question has a lot of nuances to it because African Americans sit all along the socioeconomic stratum. You know, there is way more at the lower economic social class than there is in the middle and the upper class. And I would say that overall, wherever you sit, you have a lot as an African American that you face as you go into the system, whether you come from a family with wealth and resources, or you come with a family that has limited wealth, but lots of resources within the community. And I think that we have to do way more and work much harder to get further ahead, regardless of where we fit, because there's always a notion when you're inside of a school system that, did you really earn your place here? Did you really, you know, everything that you've achieved, did that really come from you, or was there something else working against you, working for you to get you further ahead? And often you're as an African American, you're always thinking that because you know you're being judged, you're always being looked at through a different lens. And so even though we are across this larger social stratum, we do know that those who are in lower socioeconomic communities, their schools don't have the same amount of resources as those with wealth. And it's not just about public funding, it's also about schools with wealth have boosters, they have PTAs, they have different ways in which their activity funds are funded that allows for a richer, more diverse learning experience than those that are sitting in a low SES community. And on top of that, what we see happen in a lot of the low SES communities is that they're literally staffed by a lot of alternatively certified teachers who did not go through a rigorous learning teacher preparation process. So they're kind of swimming to keep their head up. And there's kids that are, as a result, getting the impact of having poorly qualified teachers in front of them. And so when you have Black excellence and Brown excellence sitting in those classrooms, sometimes it can't get tapped because the teachers aren't available to tap into it because of their own training. And that's not in all cases, but that is statistically, you see that more in Black and Brown communities versus in communities where you have much wealthier neighborhoods. They're going to have much more qualified teachers that have multiple levels of degrees, and then you have multiple resources, funding sources that help really create a different learning environment. But to say that, I'll use a personal anecdote in that I live in a relatively medium middle class community. We have resources, and I have 2 Black boys. And I've seen through their own educational experience where implicit bias has come through the way the teachers or their administrators would interact with them. And there would be this level of, well, you know, your child is not performing at this level. And so these are probably the reasons why. Do you understand about reading? Do you understand about all these things that are resources that parents of wealth have? But they would assume that because they come from a Black family that they don't have those resources. And I would have to remind them, yes, they do have those resources. And though my child is struggling, it's not because he's Black and it's not because he doesn't have resources. There's something else going on there. So I think a lot of times with Black and Brown students, when there is a struggle, we assume it's coming from a lack of resources or a lack of support or any of those things that when you're white, you don't have to have that conversation because they assume it's probably something that has to do with their learning ability or not their resources and not their environment they're growing up with. So those are a lot of different things that as African Americans, we have to contend with regardless of where we are on that economic scale that we are constantly aware of throughout our entire life. And as we're raising our own children that we're aware of and have to bring them into the situation as well when we know there's inequities within the system.
I just thank you so much. I am in such awe being a part of this panel. And the soon-to-be Dr. Seth, I need to let you know, as soon as I get finished here, I am calling Geneva Gay because you're going to give her a run for her money and she's going to be so happy because she just retired. But when I listen to you and hear you talk as a theorist, when I hear Dr. Smith talk as a mom and a scholar, and when I hear the conversation about Dr. Bell and all that he's done in terms of looking at critical race theory, you know, I don't want us to drink the wrong Kool-Aid when we talk about socioeconomic status, because see, while we've been shared the elder lens, and I thank you, Dr. Alim, for that elder lens, but I want to share that baby lens, the children, because my research is with the children. And when we talk about wealth, you know, Nikki Giovanni said, I really hope no white person ever has cause to write about me, because what he doesn't understand is Black love is Black wealth. And he'll probably go on talking about how hard my childhood was when all the time I was quite happy. So when I walk into classrooms of 5th and 6th grade African-American girls who have multiple suspensions and teachers have written them off, like you have already shared with us, Dr. Smith, you know, those little girls tell me they don't know me. They don't know nothing about me, you know, because they have what we call TWA. They talk with attitude. And we don't have to perceive the way that they talk, the tenor of how they talk, with it being negative. If we listen to the voices of the children that we serve, we will see Black brilliance in our male and our female students. And I just want to share an example of what happened with my daughter as it relates to people's perceptions about being in poverty. I'm sure all of you can relate. When you went to school, for the first time in your life, you may have been in poverty, you know, because as a graduate student, look at soon-to-be Dr. Seth smiling, you know, but it's a reality. But my daughter was in 8th grade, 6'1". She walks into the University High School of the school that I was attending. And the teacher immediately says to her, do you play basketball? Do you play volleyball? And see, they didn't know my baby girl because she was thinking, I ain't sweating my hair out. They must be crazy. But they said, well, Portia, you need to think about that because this could be your way out. And her question to her teacher was, out of what? Out of what? Unfortunately, she would not let me go up to school so I could tell the teacher off because she took care of it all by her lone self. Because when we empower our children with their identity, which you have already alluded to tonight, when they know who they are, when they know whose they are, and when we empower them to look at the world through lenses that say, I am important. I am somebody. And not just because you say it, because I know it and I live it every day. And whether they talk with their attitude, whether it's that young man that comes walking in that classroom because he's doing that brother walk, and people say to him, walk like you got some sense. And he's saying, I'm walking just like my daddy. I walk just like my grandfather. When we don't respect the integrity, and the research is real clear, there are some correlations between a parent's income level and their education level and how well their children do in school. But when they do studies that are focused specifically on looking at our children, there are many other layers to this process that we have to understand. Because when Black children know that they're loved, that they know that people care and believe in them, they will rise to any occasion. And mother's attainment and her education and their socioeconomic status has nothing to do with their success. And it does come back to what do we do in teacher development, whether it's at the undergraduate level or the graduate level. How do we empower all teachers to look at children for the wonderful, dynamic, integrity-filled individuals that they are? A. Wade Boykin extended what W.E.B. Du Bois talked about in his double consciousness. And A. Wade Boykin out of Howard University, as an African-American psychologist, says that we need to look at a triple quandary of what it means to be a person of color, of what it means to be an African-American, and what it means to be one who has not been embraced and understood, because that person is juggling all of those identities. And it is the responsibility of schools to empower that wealth, that Black wealth, that Black gold that walks into our classrooms, and not be sidetracked by, yes, many of our children fall in poverty. In the state of Texas, and I'll close with this, 58.6% of our children qualify for free and reduced lunch. That's our reality. But guess what? At the middle school and high school level, so many children don't even go get that free lunch. What does that say? When we know there's an economic challenge, but not enough for me to let you know that I'm poor, because they're not poor in spirit. And we can't use those words to identify them. So yes, in answer to that question, those differences exist, but the nuances, as you've already alluded to, we have to look at them systematically, and we have to look at them through a lens that says, again, Black Lives Matter.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, now is the time for our audience questions. And I've been previewing some of these questions. So I'm going to start first of all with you, Dr. Alumni. Here's a question for you to respond to. How do you convince school boards when evaluating curricular and texts to include the truths related to racial inequities throughout the history of this country?
Yeah, I'll return to my previous point about needing this to be really community driven. And again, learning from our history, and the power of community activism, organizing. School boards are supposed to be representatives of that community. And I think it's really important to engage. I think there was another question in there about how you involve parents. I think parents are already involved. Black parents are already involved. It's about what can the school do to recognize their engagement, whether, they don't have to come to school all the time in order to be involved. They're doing what they need to do at home, and they're really, as Dr. Webb has already, spoken to, they're already doing what they need to do with their children to really emphasize their importance of education. So I really feel that this organizing at the community level, this demanding that African-American studies, as PR had mentioned, Black studies in K through 12 is extremely important. We're starting to do that a little bit more here in Texas. It's long overdue. Students shouldn't be having to wait to undergrad or grad school to be reading these works. It should be happening a lot sooner. And so I think community-driven, figuring out ways to get representatives on the board that are going to be open to that are going to be really champions of that. And so it goes back to a political empowerment in a community kind of organizing framework of doing that.
Thank you. Dr. Smith, I'd like you to respond to this question. Of the top 10 best solutions, what are your top 3 for 2021? How can the roaring recovery and restoration from a pandemic include everyone?
I think that what we see happening right now is a lot of talk. And so I think what needs to be done is taking the talk into actions, particularly when we look at schools. We have to look at how policies support the actions. So school districts all have policies, and are the policies that are in place really supporting all learners, or are they only supporting the few? And so you have to start really doing it. And first you have to do an audit of what is happening with the community in which you're referring to. What are the strengths? What are the areas of growth? And then looking at what can we do through policy and action to move those things forward, because we want to have systemic change, not just surface level change. Because to move forward and to move everyone forward, we want to go deeper with the change. And that means it may be slow and methodical, but it's getting down to the root of what systems need to be in place and what systems need to be taken down and completely transformed. And all of that takes understanding what the system is, where we want it to go, and what are the things that are in place in the middle that get us there. Those are the things that I would say would be immediately what we have to start doing, is doing the audit, then looking at what needs to be done and what are the steps and the policies that will ensure that they happen, so those actions do actually take place, and that those who need it the most are at the center of those policies and actions.
Thank you. Mr. Seth, this next question is for you. Derek Bell and critical race theory value the oppressor-oppressed paradigm. Is this exclusive to those of alternative cultures and ethnic groupings? Does it promote defeatism in any way?
This is a very good question. So I think in short, I think I'll start with the second part of that question. Does it promote defeatism in any kind of way? I would say no. I would say, much of kind of what Derek Bell is kind of getting at, and I think this might actually speak to some of the other questions that folk have, is that it's really getting us to really think about method, or in the methodologies that we pursue that shape the kinds of questions that we ask and the kind of scholarship that we produce, is kind of what Derek Bell is getting at. So I'll just give an example very quickly. About a year ago, probably around this time, last year, there was a huge kind of study on policing that was published in all of the top journals, the American Political Science Review. I think it was, cited by the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, that a few months later, folk came out and said that, this study was mathematically flawed in a number of ways, and it had been cited by all of these top journals. And part of the reason that, well, in short, the study conducted, to be quite frank, the best way to study policing in this country isn't necessarily always through a quantitative lens, that actually just looking at the number of killings, right? How many people police officers shot, right? Just probably isn't the best way to actually get to really get a good account of what's going on with policing in America, right? So why do I use that example, right? In short, the paper was flawed because it wasn't necessarily the best way to study the issue. And I think in particular, when we're actually thinking about kind of questions related to education, and I don't think it's just a quantitative, qualitative kind of thing as well. I think kind of what Derek Bell is getting us to think about is really about the kind of assumptions that we have embedded in the models that we have, right? So understand that the data that you're presenting, right, can fall into this kind of trap of being hijacked by fictional narrative and all sorts of different things. And I think that's kind of what Derek Bell is kind of getting at with critical race theory, is that we have to really be cognizant of the methods that we use, that if you're going to use a quantitative kind of measure or measurement, right, then be clear that that's the best way to study that kind of question, right? And if you want to go out and talk to people, make sure that that's the best kind of way to do that, right? And there is data, right? This isn't this anti kind of quantitative, qualitative kind of thing, right? But it's actually just really being cognizant of the methods that we pursue, and that if we understand that racism has this kind of way of being able to shape what we do and the questions that we ask, then that's going to change a lot for what we do. So it's kind of a sporadic kind of answer, but I guess that would be my kind of answer to the questions. Really kind of what Derek Bell is kind of getting us to think about is method.
Thank you. Dr. Webb, I'm going to ask if you would respond to this last question. How will our country, state, and local communities move forward when there's so many obstacles in our P20 educational systems? These obstacles are, for instance, federal politicians, state politicians, and local politicians, school boards and school leaders, superintendents, directors, principals, teachers, and so on.
Ooh, a dynamic question. We move forward by keeping our focus on the young people that we serve. The young people we serve in pre-K through 12, the young people we serve as in undergraduate, the young people that we serve in our graduate programs. We must meet everyone where they are and take them where they need to go. And so for those politicians, for those superintendents, for those principals, for those classroom teachers who don't value education changing, because it is a lot of work, we have to, again, focus on our children and focus on their ability to dream and to bring those dreams to fruition. Because if you think about all of the wonderful profession choices that we have, how many are talking to children about what it takes to be an aerospace engineer, talking to them about what it means to become a fashion designer? We like to say doctor, lawyer, teacher, but there's a gamut of choices. And if we focus and listen to their queries, you know, this pandemic has taught us so much about our young people, these babies that really have a difficulty not seeing other children. Oh my goodness. And what this is going to mean when we go back into the schools. We've got to have someone at every strata looking and focusing on children. That means accessing their parents and their grandparents, their extended family members, looking at the wonderful cultural diversity in our state. We are a predominantly culturally and linguistically diverse state, and very few of all those folks that you called out, those obstacles, understand what that means. Our predominant population is Latinx, and we are not celebrating that. We're like, oh Lord, they're taking over. Oh my gosh, how do you take over what was your home in the first place? How do you do that? But if we don't teach teachers that, because when I've shared that with teachers, they have pre-service teachers, they have cried. They have cried. How can you say that? This is the state of Texas. This is, and we won't talk about the university right now because that's a whole nother subject, but how can this be? The reality is we have not lived up to the promise of what this nation stands for, and we've got to focus on our future, and that's our children.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop with the questions. We do have about 20 that are listed, and we've far expanded our time. But I'd like to ask the panelists if any one of you have a final thought that you'd like to share with the audience in a very concise manner. Any one of you.
I think everyone that joined this webinar wants to know more about this issue. And so I would say start this as the first point of your journey in learning more about all the things that we talked about. Find books, find groups, find people who you can have these interactions and discussions with and keep the learning going, because part of what it means to be a Trinity alumni is to be a lifelong learner and to continue to be growing and learning past our years beyond Trinity.
And Dr. Jones, I would just like to say, for all the 93 people who have joined us this evening, just talk to an African-American child about what education means to them, and listen to them and see their wonder and see their excitement and see how that can be duplicated across other cultural and racial groups in terms of talking to children. You'd be surprised how many of our children will say, well, no adult ever wanted to know my opinion. Why do you want to hear my opinion? See, I want to meet, you know, those two sons that you've talked about that you're raising, Dr. Smith. You know, I want children to meet the soon-to-be Dr. Seth. Bring more of them on the Trinity campus. We need to take the children to the campus and listen to them. Bring them into our teacher preparation classrooms and let them tell you what it feels like to have a teacher that acts like she doesn't care about you.
I just want to thank everybody for letting me be part of this, and I think that Dr. Webb and Dr. Smith spoke to this directly. And it's the idea of figuring out ways to humanize African American students and communities. Too often, what happens through our policies and our structures and institutions, and we dehumanize a huge segment of our society, and through our curriculum and through the way we kind of instill punishment at different levels. And so whatever we can do to continue to humanize educational experiences, especially for African American students and families and communities, I think that's one of the directions that we need to really head into.
And this has been fantastic. It really has been a privilege to be a part of this conversation. I guess I'll just leave with a quick kind of story that, or a quick point that one of my advisors shared with me. She said, research is seeing something that you find interesting in the world and then sitting down and whatever that thing is, sitting down and trying to make that idea, however abstract it might be, sitting down and trying to make it legible. And she said, we all can do it. We all have the capacity to do it, and we all should do it. And I guess I'm also thinking about one of Dr. Webb's points that she mentioned on layers, right? That we all have the capacity to do this kind of work. And it's hard, it's very, very hard. But I think taking some time to sit down, and I think this also speaks to Dr. Smith's point as well, let this be an opportunity to sit down and do whatever you can to try to engage with the world and its complexity. Read as much as you can, right? And it's not just, reading folk that you agree with, right? Read whatever you can, read broadly, read political science work, read education work, read anthropologists, read sociologists, read as much as you can, and try to get as full of a picture, full understanding of the picture as you can, because it's hard, it's very, very hard, but it's necessary work. I'm reminded of John Lewis, good trouble, but necessary trouble, so.
Thank you so much to the panelists. I hope you've enjoyed this very relevant and historically rich webinar experience. For additional learning together content, including other webinars, podcasts, and book club information, please visit the Lifelong Learning page on the Alumni site. Go Tigers!